Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second part two of the Lost Tools of Learning. I wanted to just quickly uh, refine the quote that I shared last time with Calvin Coolidge. The White House, December 12, 1924, he says, quote, "To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race," unquote. So my point with that was that um, being in a quote-unquote social studies class, given the Constitution on the way out, the last day of class, was really not congruent um, to true learning. It should have been actually go through the Constitution to understand it more deeply. We're going to jump right into it with the Lost Tools of Learning. And so Dorothy Sayers starts off the first paragraph essentially saying just because she doesn't specialize in education doesn't mean that she should not have the opportunity to speak into this situation. She says, quote, "that I, whose experience of teaching is extremely limited and whose life of recent years has been almost wholly out of touch with educational circles, should presume to discuss education as a matter surely that calls for no apology. It is a kind of behavior to which the present climate of opinion is wholly favorable. Bishops air their opinions about economics, biologists about metaphysics, celibates about matrimony, etc., etc." So she continues, "I would argue that sometimes it's better to get someone who's not in it to speak to it. I would equate it to going to Australia and being not being very perceptive to marsupials, and you go there and you notice kangaroos, and so as an insider you kind of get accustomed to these things. So in the area of education, I think sometimes it's better to be able to come from the outside because you see things that normally you wouldn't see. All right, the second thing she talked about is she commends teachers for their hard work and their dedication. And I essentially want to commend as well. What happens is if we can connect it to Plato's analogy of the cave. So this when you actually see the light and you go out of the cave and you see that there's a new way, not a new way, but there's a way, a right way of doing things, and then going back into the cave is where the real challenge is at, because many times people in the cave metaphorically are just used to doing things, and they don't want to essentially get away from what's normal, even if normal is dysfunctional. So that was my story, essentially trying to figure out what does it mean to really educate a child, and what does that look like. And so we're going to continue to um, speak about these premises here. The third thing she talks about is she essentially says when educational entities attempt to teach too many subjects, they do not really know what kind of person they are attempting to create. I thought that was an excellent point, and I equated to a buddy of mine who, I had an opportunity to play collegiate basketball, and so a buddy of mine I played with him, and after we both graduated, he became a head coach. And after several years, he did really well. But I remember something he said to me. I asked him, what have you learned from coaching, particularly after your first couple of years? And this is what he said. He said, one of the first things I've learned is that you can't teach too many plays because they don't learn them well. You have to teach just a few things well so that they can understand what it means to run plays. For example, if you're doing full court press and you teach 7 ways to do a full court press, and then on top of that you teach 10 inbound plays, and on top of that you teach 7 ways to play defense, etc., etc., that team is not going to learn these plays well. So you want to do is you teach a few things and you teach it well. And unfortunately, that's the state of education in America today. You have all of these electives and all of these periods and all of these quote unquote subjects, and we don't know what we're trying to produce. Okay, but the classical model really introduces several key tools for learning. Okay, the methods by which we teach students of how to learn for themselves, And then these content areas, these quote unquote subjects, they can use these tools to actually engage these topics and learn how to learn from themselves ultimately. The fourth thing she talks about is that in order to educate well, we need to return to the classical model. And I think that's a great point. Paraphrasing C.S. Lewis, he says that when you're lost, the best thing to do when finding your way is to return home. And unfortunately, in educational progressivism, quote unquote, we're graduating people, unfortunately, and the product, if you will, of what we're graduating is just not stellar. You know, it's not your C.S. Lewis's that we're graduating. It's not your G.K. Chestertons that we're graduating. It's not your Keplers and your Copernicuses, etc., etc. We're not graduating our Aristotles and our Platos. We're not graduating our Sophocleses. We're not graduating these people because we're not teaching them well. And so we're going to talk about what does that mean to educate someone well. And part of that is returning to what worked for so many years. And that is classical education. She says that if we are to produce a society of educated people fitted to preserve their intellectual freedom amid the complex pressures of our modern society, we must turn back the wheel of progress some 400 or 500 years. This is 1947. She's writing this. And she might as well be speaking today. 400 or 500 years to the point at which education began to lose sight of its true object toward the end of the Middle Ages. So the Greek and the Romans did not put vernacular to the trivium and the quadrivium. Okay, that was coined in the Middle Ages. Okay, so this is part of going back to these methods of teaching students how to learn. The fifth point she points out. She talks about before resorting to judgment and name calling that we should consider certain questions. And I really like this because when normal becomes dysfunctional, there's always skeptics. I won't even say skeptics. I will say cynics. I will say people who just don't believe that there's a right way to do things. Okay, and that's the legacy. That's a side note, but that's a legacy of postmodernism with relativism and these things. But there is a way, and we can know these things. Okay. Next point, which is prescient for today. Part of educating a child. Okay, part of educating a child is growing them. Okay, from a child to adulthood. Okay, and in our society, she talks about this long period of adolescence, and I think he hits the head right on the head with this one. Okay, this long period. If you think about 18th century, 17th century, you think about even before that time, you see of people who, particularly if you want to think about the founders or people who were just well educated, they were finishing their education by 19. By 20. Okay, very young. And part of that is because I think there is an argument for life expectancy, and when it's lower, you kind of just don't waste time with things that don't matter. Okay? Now, modern technology has put life expectancy around 80 for men, 81 for women. Okay, but unfortunately, we had this prolonged period of adolescence. Why is this important in education? Well, because part of it is actually that child being educated to live out their vocation, their God-given vocation in the free marketplace of ideas. Look what she says. She says, quote, when we think about the remarkable early age at which the young men went up to the university in, let us say, Tudor times, and thereafter were held fit to assume responsibility for the conduct of their own affairs, are we altogether comfortable about the artificial prolongation of intellectual childhood and adolescence into the years of physical maturity, which is so marked in our own day? I would say no, I'm not okay with that. I don't know why we're okay with this.